Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about setting up your camera for video. We're going to focus on three things: shooting mode, frame rate, and shutter speed. But before we start, I'd like to say that there are some slides in here that have got text on them. These are old PowerPoint slides that I've left in here just so that you can go back and refer to them as notes. I'm not going to necessarily read them word for word just because that's boring. So, first step in setting up your camera could be referring to the manual. The manual won't tell you everything you need to know, but it will tell you where the buttons are and what each button does, and it'll get you started. And if you go to the part of the manual that says how to shoot video, it's probably going to walk you through these steps right here. You're going to go to a fully auto mode, switch your camera to video. Canon has got like a little picture of a video camera. Nikon's got the same thing, a switch on the back. Sony has a dial. You're going to focus the camera. This is a good time to look at the manual again because every camera is going to be a little bit different and the focus is important. Once you get it focused, you'll push the start button. Canon has start written on their start button just in case you have not read the manual. Canon, you can also program the shutter button to start the video. Nikon's got a button with a little red dot on it. Sony has the same thing. After you push the button, there will be some kind of notice that appears on the screen, like a dot or the letters REC to let you know that you're recording. When you are done recording, push the button again. That'll stop it. You import just like you would a picture. This is in Lightroom, and there you go. So it's that easy. If you can shoot video with a cell phone, you can do it with your camera. There are some really smart people that designed and built your camera. They put a lot of knowledge into that fully automatic mode. And if you use that, you will come up with some great video. So I would say don't be afraid to use that. It'll help you get familiar with your camera and give you some confidence. But eventually, you're probably going to get to the point where you want to have a little bit more control over what you're doing. So that's what we'll talk about next. So if you're shooting video with your camera, you basically have the same choices of a mode as when you're using your camera for photos. Program is almost the same as fully auto. You can take great videos with either one of those. You can't use bulb mode for video. That won't work. You can shoot in aperture priority in order to control your depth of field, just like in photography. But if you're in aperture priority, you're allowing the camera to set the shutter speed for you, and you want to do that yourself. So I would say that if you want to control your depth of field, skip aperture and go directly to manual. So your choices are really going to boil down to manual or shutter priority or time value. There are some people that will tell you that they always shoot in manual mode and that if you don't do the same, you're somehow doing it wrong. I'm here to say, I would like to respectfully disagree with that. Here's an example of when manual mode is not the best way to go. I'm about ready to drive into this parking ramp. I have my little camera set on a manual mode. Not the best outcome. Here I am about ready to do the same thing with the camera set on fully auto. So there you go. Fully auto beats manual mode. So why don't we use fully auto all the time? Here's a shot from the Criterion taken off of the roof of Rudy's Tacos. Anybody notice a problem with that? Here it is again in slow motion. Looks good so far. Exposure is good up until right here. There's a large white umbrella fills about a quarter of the frame. The camera is trying to even out the exposure, so now the umbrella is gray and the grass here is dark green. The camera pans past the umbrella and then the exposure goes back to where it should be. So this kind of situation is not unusual. Let's say that you're filming on a street and a white pickup truck drives by, or maybe you're interviewing people and you've got someone with all black clothes on. In this kind of situation, manual setting is definitely going to be better. So this would be my rule of thumb for auto versus manual. If you have time to set up, use manual. If you're only going to get one shot, use auto. Okay, frame rate versus shutter speed. When you're shooting video, you're actually shooting a series of still pictures. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you're shooting 30 individual pictures every second. This is your frame rate or frames per second. Those are the same thing. Each one of these frames is exposed much like a photograph with its own shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. When you're setting the shutter speed of your video, you're setting the shutter speed for each individual picture. Shutter speed and frame rate are not the same thing. Before we set the shutter speed, we need to pick a frame rate. This is a list of some of the common frame rates that you might have to choose from. Before we talk about them, I'm going to get sidetracked just a little bit and talk about 24 frames per second. If you go to the internet and Google frame rates, the first thing that it's going to tell you is that 24 frames per second is what you use for cinematic video. I've got two problems with this. The first is that all cinema, all movies don't look alike. The other thing is that it's very difficult to see the difference between different frame rates. I started with the idea that I would have an experiment to see if I could see the difference between 30 frames per second and 24 frames per second. So I took this clip. It's a clip of bison in Yellowstone Park that was originally shot in 60 frames per second. I converted it to 30 frames per second and then again to 24 frames per second. Clips stacked on top of each other so that as the video plays, it will go from one to the other. I put the same three clips together side by side so they can play simultaneously. I can't see a difference between them. The reason I can't see a difference is because they're all shot at the same shutter speed. Here's a clip where you can see the difference. This one has got a little bit faster motion in it, and you can see that the one on the right is jittery while the one on the left is still relatively smooth. If we'd used a normal shutter speed, the whole thing would have been largely just a motion blur. You can get this jittery effect sometimes if you're shooting on fully auto or an aperture priority. The camera tries to get a good exposure by raising the shutter speed, and what you end up with is a video that's not smooth anymore. The best solution for this is to use a neutral density filter to cut down the amount of light that you have. In any case, if you can see the difference between different frame rates, it's mostly a result of the different shutter speed that you use. So my personal rule of thumb for frame rates, which I guess I've been following without even knowing it, is to use 60 frames per second outside and 30 inside. The exception being at night when I'll go down to 30 or even 24 in order to use the lowest possible shutter speed. So the rule of thumb for shutter speed is that the shutter speed should be twice your frame rate. If your frame rate is 30 frames per second, you should use a 1/60th of a second shutter speed. This will give just enough motion blur in each frame to give a smooth and natural looking video. But there are plenty of times when you might want to break that rule. For example, in low light, if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you can bring your shutter speed down to 1/30 in order to gather more light and avoid raising your ISO. If you're shooting outdoors at 60 frames per second and want to show more detail, for example, in sports or wildlife, you can raise your shutter speed to 200 or 500 or even higher, and it will still look reasonably smooth. Plus, you can change your shutter speed for creative reasons. Here's a clip that was shot at 60 frames per second with a very high shutter speed. The result is almost no motion blur in each frame. But the most famous example of using the wrong shutter speed is the opening scene from Saving Private Ryan. This was shot in 24 frames per second, but instead of a shutter speed of 1/48, they used the equivalent of 1/192. I should warn you that this is violent, but I've avoided the most grisly parts. At this point, you could be saying, but wait, there's still more stuff to set. And my answer to that would be, if you don't know what it is, don't change it. And if you like setting stuff, you're in good shape because there's always going to be more stuff for you to set. Okay, that's about all I've got for today. I hope your confusion level has gone down rather than up. Take care and be safe.